Hello, I'm going to do a series of short videos to make sure that we're all on the same page. I've taken the liberty of creating, or I haven't created them yet actually, I've typed in the SQL scripts for the tables that you'll need for your homework assignments and for some SQL assignments that we'll be working on this semester. And a couple things I'd like you to notice before we get too far into this. First of all, of course, I've double checked to make sure that I'm working under my own username. The most important button for me right now would be this execute button right next to my username. When I want to actually run my script, that's the button I want. Or notice I can also click the function key F5. If I need a new query, that's above my username, which shows the database instance actually. And if I need to save, I have a few save buttons up here that come in handy as well. Now to start things off, just to kind of give you an idea of how do you notate things besides your homework or beside your actual script, 2 dashes should get that done for you. So for instance, dash dash, and I can put my name. I could put the date or anything else. In addition to entering those dashes manually, there is another button that comes in handy on a couple of buttons actually that come in handy on your toolbar. One says comment out the selected lines, and the one right next to it says uncomment. So for instance, I could click the uncomment now, and notice it no longer has the dashes. What's the difference? Why do I care if something is commented out or not? Well, once you comment it out, the system ignores it. It doesn't try to actually process it as if it was part of a script. So if I need to make a comment to myself or a comment to another programmer, then this is the way that I handle one-line comments. Let me say that as well. 2-line comments, if we have to do it, I need to do that slash and an asterisk. This is a 2, and I'll come down, line comment, and then asterisk slash. And notice that's how we do multi-line comments if we need to do them. Now, I've mentioned that I've already entered in the script for my table creation. I've got them all here. Something to mention: this could have been one really long line for all that SQL Server cares. So for instance, I could do this. The spacing that I've used, the indentation, if any, that I've used, is just to make life more reader friendly, just to make my text more reader friendly for me. SQL Server doesn't care. I'd like you to also notice the structure that we have. If you want to create a table, well, that's the command that you use. And so the very first thing that we do, if we're going to create a table, we use that create table statement. We then name the table. You see some squiggly lines here, and they're here because actually I created a couple of tables before. I've since deleted them, but the system knows that they were there at some point. So it still has the squiggly lines under there to warn me that, hey, there's already an object named vendor in the database. Well, there really isn't. But I created these 3 tables initially, but only 3 tables. So notice my additional statements don't have the squiggly lines for the table creation process. It's kind of a glitch. You'll recognize over time there's some squiggly lines that you do have to worry about and some that you don't. For instance, let me scroll down here just a bit. And here is a squiggly line or a set of squiggly lines under my foreign keys. Well, the reason SQL Server is fussing about that is because I haven't created the primary key partners yet. So those are squiggly lines I could ignore. So notice for my create table statements, we use the create table command. We name the table vendor, and then we place, for readability's sake, each column or each field on its own line. We specify the data type, the field size for the data type. So for instance, vendor ID is going to be char or car for character, And apparently we're willing to dedicate a field size of 2 to vendor ID. Not null, you have two options, either null or not null, which means are you willing to let no data be entered for that particular field? Now for us, we're typically entering that primary key field first. And no, we don't typically ever want a primary key field to have null values in them. So primary key fields will always have not null. And so you'll see a lot of not nulls. That means the user has to enter something for that field. And finally, notice also that we separate each column with a comma. That's very important. Vendor name in this example is varchar, or variable character. And the difference between char and varchar, with char, or that character data type, we're saying that we know exactly how wide or how much of a field size we need. When we use char for varchar, it could be up to 25. It can't be any more than 25. So a vendor name of 10 would be fine. A vendor name of 25 would be fine. 26 would not be fine. So you see how we handle the primary key. The primary key, we have a special line for it. You have to be very careful about closing all of your parentheses. So we open a parentheses to start our column names. Notice we also open the parentheses to name our primary key. Vendor ID will be the primary key. We closed the parentheses for that primary key field, and then we closed the entire statement in a sense. And we also always end with a semicolon. A special note about ending with a semicolon: actually, a lot of database management systems aren't ticky about that. Microsoft SQL Server isn't ticky about that yet, making sure that you end your statement with a semicolon, but Microsoft says they're going to get ticky, so it's probably good to be in the habit of making sure that you terminate your SQL script statements with a semicolon. Now, in terms of running the script, we have a couple of options. I can press execute right now, or the function key F5 right now, and Microsoft will run every single script. And as long as I know they all work perfectly, that's no problem. Or I can choose to select part of this script page. For instance, I can choose just to run the table part of this by selecting and pressing execute. As a matter of fact, let's go ahead and do it that way first. So I'm going to grab my create table vendor and choose execute. And down here at the bottom, notice my command completed successfully. Now I'm looking at my database instance that has my username, and I didn't see a table show up over here to the left. Sometimes you have to go up here to refresh to get that to show up. And so now notice I have my very first brand new table. And if I expand this by clicking the plus sign, I see columns, keys, constraints, triggers. We haven't talked about triggers and indexes and statistics yet. Constraints may have already been mentioned in your textbook, but we know that we do have keys. We just talked about one key being the vendor ID for the vendor table. And I can also see my columns if I expand the columns folder. And so there's vendor ID, char2, not null, vendor name. You get the gist of this. So I've got a couple of options here, and I'm going to get rid of this properties window over here to the right. I don't need it. Now, what about running the rest of my tables? I don't want Microsoft SQL Server. I don't want SQL Server to consider this vendor part of the script anymore because I've already run it. So I have a couple of options. I'm tongue-tied tonight. I can either comment it out, and now it will be ignored. Or, as I mentioned before, I'm going to uncomment now. As I mentioned before, I could simply, I don't want to do that one though. I could leave that uncommented and specify, hey, only create the table category. The option is totally up to me. I think what I'll do is I'll comment out that vendor table since it's been created. And why don't I just see if the rest of my script will work? And it did. I didn't have any typing errors, etc. Now, as I browse through my script, there's a couple of more things that I'd like to mention as I go along. But first, I would really appreciate it if my tables showed up over here to the left. So I'm going to click refresh. And now I see them all listed. So they're ready for me to insert data into them. But before I insert data into them, let me mention a couple of more things. Notice we have some additional data types. Now the first table that the first set of tables that you created were actually in Microsoft Access. Microsoft Access is a really nice personal desktop database management system. And some of the data types for Microsoft Access will be different than some of the data types for SQL Server. Some things will be the same, some things won't be the same, and that will be the same between many different database management systems. For instance, MySQL, my undergraduate e-commerce class, will be using the MySQL database. There's some differences there. Oracle is another database management system. There'll be some differences there. So for instance, I think money is a data type that you can use for SQL Server, but money is not one perhaps that you can use in Microsoft Access. I may have that backwards. I have several database management systems in my head. Something else to mention since we're here on the product table is we specified the primary key, of course. Notice all of these are not null, so the user is going to have to enter a value for the records when it gets to these columns. But notice we also specified foreign key. One thing that you guys will have to keep in mind if you can, try to keep a visual of your relational schema that we did, I guess, in chapter 3. And that will kind of help you know what you're doing. There's a relationship between the vendor table and the product table based on the vendor ID. And I could go grab that. I think I did include a copy of that relational schema in your discussion post for this chapter. So if you could give that a quick check, you'll see the line between vendor ID in the vendor table and vendor ID in the product table. Well, this is how we tell SQL Server that that line exists and that there is a relationship between those two tables. And apparently there's also a relationship between the category table, notice category here, and the product table. So here's category ID in the product table. Here is category ID in the category table. So we have to show Microsoft SQL Server those connections. We did not have to identify foreign keys in Microsoft Access. We did have to identify the primary keys, but in SQL Server you have to identify both. The last thing to mention, I think here before we push on, is you have to be careful about the order of the tables that you create. For instance, I would not want to create the product table before I created the category table. Why? Because the product table has a foreign key referencing a category ID. If it doesn't find a category ID already in the system, well, it's going to complain about that. But for now, we have created our tables. It's probably a good time to go out and create our insert table script now. One last thing that I think I'll do is I'm going to press my save here. And notice if I go ahead and save right now, it's going to save on some folder on the University of Arkansas location. But let's see if I set up my local resources correctly. I don't always do that. And look at that. I see C on Vicky and D on Vicky. So that's got to be mine. Let's see if it's going to work for me here. And it did. So I could find my desktop if I wanted to hunt that down. I can temporarily save on the desktop here. It may let me do that. Let me check first before I commit to that. I'll just type create statements and save. Alright, notice I can also select all and copy. Let's test this as well. I can grab this title bar, and behind that window I still have my own window. So let's see if I can get Notepad up, and perhaps I can paste. Yeah. So now I could actually save this on my own hard drive. And this is really handy if you do the settings right when you first install SQL Server on the server. We didn't have to worry about that. My undergrads have to worry about also installing SQL Server, but you guys didn't have to do that. And so I'm going to save it out here. Create statements. The good part about that is I could delete all of this and do it again. I think I'll show you that perhaps in the next video, now that I have a copy of all of this. And by the way, usually, minimize that. Usually we don't save that as a text file. Usually what I would do is save that as an SQL file. And notice that my system, since it has Microsoft SQL Server installed, this is a cue to it, of course, to open it with SQL Server. But that's a local installation for me. So let's go ahead and stop here, and we'll pick up in the next video.